The cold metal restraints dug into Scott Michael Boland's wrists, but he barely flinched. Years of combat had trained his body to ignore pain, to accept discomfort as nothing more than a distraction. He sat motionless in the dimly lit chamber of the alien transport vessel, his face cast in the eerie glow of pulsing red lights embedded in the walls. The air smelled metallic, tinged with something acrid that burned at the back of his throat. Around him, the alien guards stood rigid, their exoskeletal armor gleaming with a dull sheen, their inhuman eyes locked onto him like a predator watching wounded prey. Scott kept his breathing slow, his posture slack, his face creased with the perfect mix of confusion and weariness. He was, after all, supposed to be just an old man in easy capture, no threat to an empire as vast and advanced as the Romulan. That illusion was his greatest weapon, and he wielded it with the patience of a seasoned tactician. One of the aliens, slightly taller than the rest, stepped forward. Its chitinous fingers twitched as it regarded him, head tilting slightly. Its voice was a series of clicks and guttural tones, but through the neural translator embedded in Scott's inner ear, the meaning came through clearly. This human is frail. It offers no challenge. The soldier sneered, if such an expression could be applied to an alien face. Are we sure it is worth the effort of transport? Another, this one with darkened plates along its shoulders, responded. The general commanded all human military figures to be taken alive. We do not question orders. Scott kept his expression blank, eyes shifting between them as if struggling to follow the conversation. Let them believe he was nothing more than a confused, aging captive. Let them underestimate him. The ship vibrated as it began its descent. They were approaching their hidden stronghold. Scott tensed inwardly, but gave no external sign of his rising anticipation. Every second that passed brought him closer to his objective, the very reason he had allowed himself to be taken. As the vessel landed, the magnetic clamps hissing as they locked into place, the guards seized him roughly, dragging him forward. He let his body sag slightly, just enough to sell the image of frailty, even as his sharp gaze took in every detail around him. The way the ship's bulkheads gleamed with organic metal fusions, the way the Romulan carried their weapons, the formation of their security details. Every observation was data, and data was power. The ramp extended, revealing a landscape shrouded in perpetual dusk. Jagged rock formations jutted from the ground like the bones of some long-dead giant, and above them, a thick, swirling mist clung to the air. The stronghold was carved into the side of a mountain, its exterior disguised to blend with the terrain. If not for his intel, no human would have ever suspected that an alien fortress lay hidden here, deep within Earth's own borders. Scott was led through towering corridors, the walls alive with undulating pulses of energy, shifting like veins beneath the creature's skin. The air was heavy with a strange humidity, the temperature just a degree too warm. The Romulan had been here for a long time, perhaps longer than anyone had realized. They marched him into a cavernous chamber, where a raised platform overlooked rows of massive holographic displays. Alien text and symbols flickered across the screens, strategic movements, encrypted transmissions, pieces of a puzzle Scott was only beginning to assemble. If he could just get a message out, just one transmission, Earth's forces would finally have the location they needed to strike. A commanding presence loomed ahead, taller than the others, its exoskeleton a deep obsidian with veins of gold running through it, stood a Romulan officer. Its six-fingered hands flexed as it observed him with what could only be described as amusement. This is the human they captured. Its voice was smoother than the others, more controlled. It hardly seems worth the effort. The guard beside Scott responded. Orders were to retrieve any humans suspected of military connections. The officer tilted its head, stepping closer. You speak. Scott licked his lips, as if parched and disoriented. He let his voice waver slightly, his words slow. I don't understand. A chuckle, low and chittering. Oh, you will? With a flick of its wrist, A surge of energy coursed through Scott's restraints, sending sharp, searing pain through his arms. His knees buckled, his body jerking involuntarily. But he did not cry out. Pain was a language he had long since learned to ignore. The officer watched him for a long moment before turning away, dismissing him with a bored wave. Take him to the containment cells. We will determine his usefulness later. Scott was dragged down another series of tunnels, deeper into the stronghold. The further they went, the more he could feel it, the hum of energy resonating through the walls, the faint but unmistakable presence of something massive, something hidden beneath the surface. Then he saw it. As they passed an opening in the corridor, his gaze flickered to the side, catching a glimpse of the vast hangar bay below. Rows upon rows of towering war machines stood dormant, their sleek forms glistening under the artificial light. These were not just transports. They were planetary invasion craft, fully armed, ready. A cold realization settled over him. This wasn't just a hidden base. This was a launch point. The Romwan weren't waiting anymore. Their invasion was imminent. He needed to get that message out. Fast. Thrown into a cell, the force field activated behind him with a faint hum. He staggered, then righted himself, scanning his surroundings. The cell was barren, save for a single bench and the soft glow of alien energy flowing through the walls. A voice cut through the silence. "You're new." Scott turned sharply, his eyes locking onto the figure in the neighboring cell. A man mid-40s, rugged, his once pristine military jacket now tattered, sat against the far wall. He smirked, his voice laced with a strange mix of amusement and resignation. "Didn't expect to see another human in here. Thought I was the last one they bothered keeping alive." Scott studied him, his mind racing. "Who are you?" The man stretched, rolling his shoulders. "Nathaniel Riggs. Used to be special ops. Used to think I was good at staying hidden." He gestured vaguely to their surroundings. "Guess I was wrong." Scott remained silent, his mind piecing together the implications. If Riggs had been here long enough to observe, to learn he could be useful. Riggs raised a brow. "You got a name, old man? Or do I just call you the unlucky bastard?" Scott allowed a small, knowing smile to tug at the corner of his lips. "Michael Boland," he said simply. Riggs' eyes flickered with something, recognition. "No kidding," he exhaled, shaking his head. "They have no idea who they just locked up, do they?" Scott's smile deepened just slightly. "Not yet." Riggs chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, this just got interesting." Scott glanced toward the energy field securing their cells, then beyond, to the hallways crawling with alien guards, to the war machines lying in wait. His chip had already begun transmitting, sending fragments of their coordinates into the ether. But it wasn't enough. He needed to reach a better vantage point, ensure the signal reached Earth's forces. Time was against him. The Romwan would begin their scans soon. He looked at Riggs, his mind already formulating the next steps. "We won't be in here long," Scott said. Riggs snorted. "Oh yeah? You got a plan?" Scott's eyes gleamed with something dangerous. "Always." "So, Scott Boland," Riggs said, leaning against the energy barrier separating their cells. "You planning on breaking out of here by yourself, or were you going to loop me in at some point?" Scott didn't open his eyes. "That depends. You willing to take orders? Or do you plan on making this difficult?" Riggs let out a sharp laugh. "If you've got a plan better than waiting to die, I'm all ears." Scott finally looked at him, studying the man who had survived a year in this hellhole. He had the hardened look of a soldier who had seen too much, the wiry frame of a man forced to ration his strength. But his eyes were still sharp, still full of fight. That was enough for Scott. "They'll scan us soon," he said. "Standard biological examination. But they don't just look for infections or physical weaknesses. They scan for modifications. If they pick up my implant, they'll either cut it out or burn it out." Riggs frowned. "So that's what this is about. You've got a tracker." "Something better," Scott said. not just a location ping. My implant transmits low-frequency bursts of coded data. Right now, Earth's military is getting the general coordinates of this base, but the structure, defenses, personnel numbers, they need more than just a red dot on a map. Riggs tilted his head, considering. And let me guess, you need to get closer to a terminal or somewhere with less interference. Scott gave a small nod. This base is running dampeners, shields, frequency scramblers. Standard for an enemy stronghold. But there will be weak spots. I just need time. Riggs exhaled. Then we better figure out how to buy you some. The lights above flickered, and the force field shifted slightly. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. 2 Romwan guards approached, weapons slung across their insectoid bodies, their faces devoid of anything resembling human emotion. Stand, one of them ordered. Scott and Riggs complied. The restraints snapped onto their wrists with an unnatural precision, adjusting tightly enough to be uncomfortable, but not enough to cut off circulation. Scott let himself be led through the winding corridors of the stronghold, his steps deliberately slow, his gaze constantly shifting. He counted the guards. He measured the response time between their movements. He noted the frequency of the security drones that hovered above their heads, their sleek, silver plating reflecting the dim artificial lighting. Every detail was a puzzle piece, and puzzles were meant to be solved. They were brought to a medical examination chamber, a sterile space with smooth, black walls that pulsed faintly, as though the structure itself was alive. An array of alien medical devices stood in the center, their insect-like appendages twitching in anticipation. A Romwan technician, smaller than the soldiers, but more deliberate in its movements, gestured toward a scanning device. One at a time, Riggs hesitated, but Scott stepped forward first. Better to be the one to test the process than to risk unexpected variables. He lay back on the scanning platform, his body rigid as the machine whirred to life. A blue light passed over him, humming in an eerie rhythm. The machine's arms moved, shifting its angles, recalibrating. Scott forced his breathing to remain steady. Then the machine stuttered. A flicker in the power supply. A brief hesitation in the alien interface. Scott's stomach tightened. The technician tilted its head, its mandibles clicking. It adjusted the machine, rerunning the scan. Scott knew what would come next. Anomalous biological reading detected. The machine intoned in its mechanical voice. The guard stiffened. Scott acted first. With a practiced motion, he rolled off the scanner, twisting his restrained hands beneath him. Before the nearest guard could react, Scott snapped his foot upward, striking the Romwan technician in the thorax. The alien stumbled back, hissing in surprise. In that split second, Riggs moved, slamming his shoulder into the other guard, sending them both sprawling. Alarms blared. Scott pivoted, his movements precise, controlled. He seized the fallen technician's arm, twisting it sharply. The alien shrieked, and its exoskeletal armor cracked under the force. Riggs, meanwhile, grappled with the other guard, narrowly dodging a swing from the creature's elongated claw. He managed to drive his knee into its midsection, buying just enough time for Scott to take control of the technician's console. The moment he activated the panel, the interference in the room lessened. His chip pulsed, sending a full data burst. He didn't have time to verify if it had gone through. More guards were coming. Scott grabbed a fallen weapon, a sleek, rifle-like device, with an unfamiliar firing mechanism. He had no time to figure it out. Instead, he turned and ran. Riggs followed, both of them barreling through the winding hallways, dodging blasts of energy that seared the walls around them. Scott processed their situation at lightning speed. They were deep in the stronghold, at least 3 levels underground. They needed to get up to a higher vantage point where transmissions wouldn't be dampened. The upper decks, Scott called out, ducking behind a bulkhead as another blast of energy whizzed past his head. We need a direct line of sight to the atmosphere. Riggs panted beside him, gripping the stolen weapon. And how exactly do you plan on getting past the entire Romulan army? Scott exhaled. We improvise. Another explosion rocked the facility. The emergency sirens wailed, signaling a lockdown. Scott realized the true nature of what was happening. The stronghold wasn't just preparing for battle. It was activating. He glanced at Riggs, whose expression had shifted from determination to grim understanding. They're about to launch the invasion, aren't they? Riggs asked. Scott didn't answer immediately. He was too busy thinking, too busy adjusting the strategy in his mind. The original mission had been about sending a location. Now it was about stopping a war before it began. There was no turning back now. He tightened his grip on the weapon, his old bones screaming in protest. But pain was nothing. Fear was nothing. The only thing that mattered was finishing what he started. He looked at Riggs. You with me? Riggs let out a low chuckle. Do I have a choice? Scott smirked. Not really. Then they ran. The corridors burned with the pulsing glow of alarm sirens, casting flickering crimson light against the metallic walls. Scott ran, his breaths controlled, measured, even as his muscles screamed in protest. Decades of battle-hardened instinct took over, pushing him forward, keeping his mind sharp despite the chaos unfolding around him. Riggs was just behind him, the weight of his stolen Romulan weapon balanced against his chest, his boots pounding against the alien alloy floor. The entire stronghold was coming alive. More than just an emergency response, this was activation. Scott could hear the shift in the hum of the structure itself, the deep resonance of engines hidden beneath the facility's surface. They weren't just preparing for pursuit. They were preparing for war. A plasma blast screamed past his shoulder, slamming into the wall beside him in a shower of molten sparks. He pivoted without breaking stride, ducking as Riggs spun and returned fire. The stolen Romulan rifle let out a sharp, concussive burst, the energy shot striking a pursuing alien in the chest. The creature reeled back, its exoskeletal armor cracking under the force before it crumpled to the ground. Scott didn't stop moving. Stopping meant dying. We need a way up, Riggs shouted over the chaos, his voice tight with exertion. This whole place is locking down. Scott was already scanning ahead, mind working at a relentless pace. The facility was built for defense, layers upon layers of reinforced corridors designed to trap invaders, to isolate and exterminate intruders with ruthless efficiency. Their only chance was getting to the upper levels, a direct line to the outside, where Scott's implant could send an undistorted signal to Earth's forces. He spotted an elevator shaft at the end of the corridor, its doors partially open, revealing the dark abyss beyond. There, he barked. The moment they reached it, Scott jammed his fingers between the doors, wrenching them apart with a grunt of effort. Beyond the threshold, the elevator car was nowhere to be seen, only a vast, vertical tunnel stretching deep into the facility's core. Riggs glanced down, then up. I hope you've got a plan, old man, because I left my grappling hook at home. Scott smirked despite the adrenaline pounding through his veins. We climb? He didn't hesitate. Grabbing onto the side rungs embedded in the wall, he hauled himself upward, ignoring the burning protest of his aging muscles. Riggs followed suit, moving fast, but keeping his head on a swivel. Below, the sound of alien voices echoed through the halls, pursuers closing in. Scott climbed faster. The shaft was vast, stretching several stories up to a maintenance hatch. They were nearly there when a deafening explosion rocked the structure. Scott's grip faltered for a fraction of a second as a shockwave rippled through the facility. Below, something gave way. A secondary detonation, sending a massive fireball roaring up the shaft, consuming everything in its path. Move! Scott shouted, gripping the rungs with white-knuckled force. The heat licked at their heels as they ascended, the air tightening with smoke and energy discharge. Riggs gritted his teeth, his face illuminated in the hellish glow beneath them. Just as the fire threatened to engulf them, Scott reached the top, slamming his fist against the emergency hatch, forcing it open with brute strength. He scrambled through, turning to grip Riggs' wrist, just as the younger man lunged upward. A final burst of fire shot through the shaft as Scott yanked Riggs clear. They collapsed onto the metal grating, coughing against the thickening smoke, their bodies trembling from exertion. "Remind me," Riggs wheezed between gasps, "to never do that again." Scott ignored the ache in his limbs as he got back to his feet, eyes sweeping the area. They had emerged into a control nexus, a circular command station with multiple data terminals, hollow displays flickering with alien script and schematics of Earth's orbital defenses. A heavy realization settled over him. "They're already past reconnaissance," he murmured. "This isn't a scouting mission. This is pre-invasion positioning." Riggs staggered upright, his gaze following Scott's. "Then we need to stop this. Right now." Scott's eyes locked onto a central console, larger than the others, its interface flashing rapidly. He moved toward it, fingers dancing over the unfamiliar controls, forcing his chip to sync with the alien technology. The signal connected. For the first time, he felt the unfiltered transmission go out, a powerful, unimpeded burst of data straight to Earth's fleet. Every detail, every defense point, the location of every hidden Romulan stronghold across the planet. It was everything they needed to turn the tide. But the Romulan weren't about to let him finish. A roar of alien voices erupted as the doors to the control room slid open. Soldiers poured in, weapons raised. Scott didn't hesitate. He spun, grabbed a plasma rifle off the console and fired. The first shot took down a soldier before they could react. The second slammed into the chest of another, sending the alien crashing backward. Riggs was already moving, rolling behind cover, unleashing return fire with deadly precision. A hulking Romulan commander stepped into the room, its armor layered in thick, golden plating, its presence radiating authority. Its insectoid mandibles clicked in a series of guttural sounds before the translator crackled to life. "You have no idea what you've done," it said, voice dripping with contempt. Scott leveled his rifle. "Oh, I think I do." The commander moved like lightning, lunging forward with a bladed weapon, forcing Scott to deflect with the butt of his rifle. The impact sent shockwaves through his bones, but he held firm. Riggs flanked from the side, firing a direct shot into the commander's leg, staggering the creature for half a second. Just enough time for Scott to drive his knee into its abdomen. It barely faltered. With inhuman strength, the commander backhanded Scott, sending him slamming against a console. Pain flared through his ribs, but he gritted his teeth and rolled to avoid a follow-up strike. Riggs dove past him, bringing his stolen weapon up, firing a precise shot directly into the commander's exposed throat. The alien staggered. Then it collapsed. Scott pulled himself upright, breathing hard. Around them, the remaining Romulan forces hesitated, seeing their leader fall. Then, from above, a new sound split the air. The thunderous roar of human warships breaking into the atmosphere. The signal had gone through. Earth's forces had arrived. Explosions rocked the stronghold, the walls trembling as orbital bombardments tore into the mountainside. Through the shattered view screens, Scott could see dozens of human dropships descending, fire raining from the sky like judgment itself. Riggs let out a breathless chuckle. "You really did it?" Scott lifted his weapon, glancing at the younger soldier with a wry smirk. "We did." The stronghold was falling apart, panic spreading through the remaining Romulan. But Scott knew this battle wasn't over. This was only the beginning. He turned toward the exit, the air thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning metal. "We're not done yet," he said. "We take as many of them down as we can before this place burns." Riggs nodded, gripping his rifle. And together, they charged into the fire. The sky was fire. Scott ran through the crumbling corridors of the stronghold, his boots pounding against shifting debris as explosions ripped through the facility. The air was thick with acrid smoke, each breath laced with the stench of burning metal and alien flesh. The mountain rumbled beneath him, the Romwan base collapsing in on itself under the relentless bombardment from Earth's fleet. Riggs was beside him, rifle raised, eyes scanning for movement. The flickering emergency lights cast jagged shadows along the walls, but the enemy was still here, desperate, cornered, and ready to die fighting. They reached an intersection, and Scott skidded to a halt. Ahead, through the reinforced windows of the upper levels, the battlefield unfolded in horrifying clarity. Earth's forces had arrived in full force. Human warships loomed in the storm-darkened sky, unleashing precise orbital strikes that shattered Romwan defensive positions. Dropships touched down on the jagged rock formations outside the base, deploying ground troops in mechanized exosuits, their armor gleaming under the chaotic bursts of light from aerial dogfights overhead. But the Romwan weren't fleeing. They were fighting back with everything they had. Scott could see it now. This was the stronghold. Not just a launch point. Not just a strategic outpost. This was a command center, and the Romwan would rather die here than let humanity seize it. "We need to move," Riggs said, voice sharp with urgency. "This whole place is caving in, and I really don't feel like getting buried under an alien war base today." Scott wasn't listening. His gaze had locked onto something in the distance, across the battlefield. A warship, half buried in the mountainside, its colossal hull lined with pulsating energy conduits. It wasn't launching. It was transmitting. He understood immediately. "They're calling reinforcements," he said. Riggs followed his line of sight. His face paled slightly. "How many?" Scott clenched his jaw. "Enough to turn this into a massacre." The Romwan weren't just defending their base. They were stalling, holding Earth's forces in place while their distress signal reached the outer systems. If that message got out, they wouldn't be facing an invasion force. They'd be facing a war of extinction. Scott turned sharply, gripping Riggs' shoulder. "We need to shut it down. Now." Riggs hesitated for only half a second before nodding. "Then, let's go." They sprinted down the corridor, dodging falling debris as the structure groaned under the weight of its own destruction. Alien soldiers emerged from the smoke, weapons raised, but Scott and Riggs moved with lethal precision. A plasma burst seared past Scott's shoulder, singing his jacket, but he didn't flinch. He fired back, a controlled shot that caught the enemy in the throat. Riggs dropped another before he could raise his weapon, the alien's body slumping against the charred floor. They pushed forward, weaving through the ruins of the stronghold, their every step taking them closer to the warship. Scott could feel the energy pulsing beneath his feet now, the ship's systems ramping up, preparing for a final transmission. As they neared the massive docking bay, the blast doors began to seal shut. Scott's mind worked at a blistering pace. If those doors closed, they had no way in. He lunged forward, grabbing a fallen alien rifle, bulkier than the standard weapons, its barrel glowing with unstable power. No time for precision. No time for calculations. He aimed directly at the closing doors and fired. The weapon discharged with a violent shockwave, a concussive blast that struck the control panel, short-circuiting the mechanism. The doors shuddered, freezing half open, sparks raining from their fractured servos. Scott didn't stop to admire his work. He and Riggs forced their way through the gap, slipping inside just as the heavy plating groaned, partially closing behind them. The interior of the warship was alive. Glowing conduits lined the walls, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm, as if the ship itself was breathing. Alien runes and symbols scrawled across the curved architecture, ancient and unknowable. At the heart of the chamber, a massive transmission relay pulsed, its energy conduit connected directly to the ship's central core. And standing before it, waiting, was the last commander of the Romwan stronghold. It was taller than the others, its exoskeleton marked with golden ridges, its armor heavier, adorned with deep scars from battles long past. Its insectoid eyes glowed a deep violet, filled with something cold and patient. It did not speak immediately. It only observed. Then, in a voice thick with contempt, it said, "You are too late, human." Scott raised his weapon. "We'll see about that." The Romwan commander lunged. It moved with impossible speed, crossing the distance between them in an instant. Its massive blade swinging in a deadly arc. Scott barely dodged in time, the edge grazing his shoulder, slicing through fabric and drawing blood. Riggs fired 3 quick shots, but the commander's armor absorbed the impact, the energy dispersing harmlessly. Scott dropped low, sweeping his leg in an attempt to knock the alien off balance. The commander anticipated it, twisting midair, bringing its weapon down in a vicious overhead strike. Scott caught the blow with the barrel of his rifle, metal screaming against alien steel. The force nearly broke his arms, but he held firm, twisting his body to redirect the momentum. The blade sank into the floor beside him, and in that split second of vulnerability, Riggs aimed for the exposed gap in the commander's plating and fired point-blank. The shot punched through. The alien staggered, its armor cracking, but it wasn't dead yet. Scott didn't give it a chance to recover. With all his strength, he grabbed the commander by the throat, driving it backward, straight into the ship's exposed power core. The alien screamed, electricity surging through its body, its limbs convulsing as its armor fused to the pulsating machinery. The energy overload sent a shockwave through the chamber, flickering lights cascading across the walls. Scott turned, breathing hard. The transmission relay flickered, shutting down. The message would never reach its destination. They had won, but the ship was failing. Alarms blared, the core destabilizing. The warship was going down, and it was taking the entire stronghold with it. Scott grabbed Riggs, dragging him toward the emergency hatch. The docking bay was already filling with fire, the mountain collapsing around them. "Jump!" Scott roared. They leapt. The force of the explosion catapulted them forward, throwing them clear of the warship as it detonated behind them, a blinding pillar of fire ripping through the mountainside. They hit the rocky terrain hard, tumbling down the jagged slope. The world was a blur of heat and destruction, of fire and chaos. When Scott finally stopped rolling, his vision swam. He coughed, tasting blood, his body bruised, battered, but alive. He looked up. Above him, in the darkened sky, the remaining Romwan forces were retreating. Their fleet, scattered, broken. Earth's military had pushed them back. They had won. Riggs groaned beside him. "Next time, remind me to just die in my cell." Scott laughed, a short, breathless sound. He gripped Riggs' arm, pulling him upright. The battle was over. But the war? That was just beginning. And Scott Michael Boland would be there when it ended.